we've had there. You know, being a Northern Yankee, I always gotta laugh at these Texas people.
I know, right?
But here we are all back together again.
Yeah, but we laugh at you when it's 110 in the sun.
That's true.
And we manage and you don't.
That's true.
Sorry about that.
Shouldn't pick on Southern. All right, well, I just want to remind you that not only do we have a seminar today that I'll explain in a minute, we also have lots of good seminars coming up. Next week we have a seminar on paper sensors or formaldehyde detection, brought to you by Dr. Fernand's research group. Also on February 8th, we have a materials engineer from University of Texas Tyler who will be coming out, Xing Chao. Okay. Also in February the 15th, we have Wheels giving us a talk. And we have a sequel to Wheels on the 22nd of February, which is AT Catalyst, Dr. or Mrs. Usman's new sort of project going on there. So lots of good things coming up here in February. But today, it's our pleasure to have with us Dr. Edward Hamilton, one of our noted physics teachers, right? He got his bachelor's degree from Calvin College, same place that I did. We were there at different times, I believe. Never knew each other.
He was there first.
I was there first. Okay. Yep. All right. And so Dr. Hamilton has been here since when?
Oh boy, 2012?
2012.
Yeah.
So, good number of years. And I'm sure that you've all appreciated having class with him if you have. And if you haven't, you know, you have something to look forward to. He's going to talk to us today about the reintegration of the integration of faith and science. So let's give Dr. Hamilton a big round.
Just to provide a little bit of background, this right here is a talk I gave at the Kairos Conference last fall. The Kairos Conference is up at Calvin College, so I get a chance to go back and see my alma mater and see my family back up in Michigan. And at the same time, it was a chance to get to know a bunch of other people all around the country who are interested in faith, learning, integration issues. This conference is devoted to fundamental concepts in that debate, so kind of the underlying philosophy of what it means to pursue faith, learning, integration. And there really wasn't a lot of contributions that were being made by people who come from the scientific community. It's primarily a humanities-oriented conference. It draws people from virtually every level. I heard talks that were being given by people down at the early elementary level, teaching kindergartners, all the way up to people teaching seminarians at theological seminaries. I suppose maybe there's more in common between those two things than I've heard. But the point is that this conference was devoted toward the foundational ideas of what it means to integrate education and faith at every single stage of that process. And what I wanted to do was to come in and talk a little bit about the perspective that I thought could be brought by somebody who comes from the natural sciences to those more fundamental philosophical questions. One thing I want to emphasize about this is that the approach I'm bringing here today is one that is not very quantitative, which is unusual for science. Usually scientists come in and we give data, we slap data up there on the screen, we try to make sure that we have rigorously testable hypotheses, and this kind of a presentation was really something I hadn't done since I was a college student myself, coming in and giving a talk about philosophical categories and ideas. And so it was a little bit outside of my comfort zone. This is basically what I want to talk about right here, and this talk is in some sense about an interdisciplinary approach and requires the use of interdisciplinary approaches in the course of the talk. So it demonstrates some of the ideas it's attempting to promote in the process of being given. One thing I want to emphasize is that this sort of historical context, being able to look at other examples of people tackling problems that are similar to the problems that you're tackling, is always a valuable thing to do. And it reminds you of the fact that the problems that you're tackling might not be so new or unique or difficult as they might at first appear to be. If you look back historically at the development of lots of other things that we take for granted, what you discover is the thing that we take for granted, the emergent synthesis of ideas, is something that emerged only after a long period of struggle or controversy in which things that seem natural to us seemed anything but natural to people who were debating those issues at the time. Let me go ahead and begin by talking a little bit about an idea I came up with about what faith learning integration really represents relative to the larger university system. We all know that historically, a large number, what we think of today as secular universities, actually came out of a Christian background, and they slowly lost that Christian identity over a period of time. And the faith learning debate was, in some sense, an attempt to fight back against that trend, to say, well, hopefully the second generation of Christian educational institutions won't follow exactly that same trajectory. One of the interesting things, though, is that faith learning integration, if you go back and read the literature from 50, 60, 70 years ago, emerged in the context of a much larger debate. This tree down here at the bottom right here is a Cassia grandis tree. They have these giant seed pods hanging down from them right there. And these seed pods, have you ever seen them? They seem a little ridiculous, don't they? I mean, I remember being terrified by these sorts of seed pods when I was a little kid. They looked like evil witches' fingers coming down from the tree to grab you, and they gave me nightmares. And when you get older, you start thinking, why on earth would a tree have seed pods that look like this? Usually trees, they produce seeds, and the seeds either have some way of spreading by blowing on the wind, which these things are obviously much too heavy to do, or they have some kind of bird that comes along and eats the seeds, and when the birds eat the seeds, they fly someplace else and spread the seeds as a result of their digestive process. And these seeds seem like they're pretty worthless. They're just going to drop to the ground right here and try to make additional trees right underneath the tree that's above them, which seems like a bad place for trees to grow. And the answer is that these Cassia grandis fruits right here emerge in a completely different ecosystem. And they emerge in an ecosystem in which they had a natural route of propagation because there was a species that fed on these giant pods right here. What do you suppose ate these giant pods?
Giraffes?
Not giraffes, that's actually a pretty good guess. They're North American, I'll give you that hint. They're North American. What would be big enough to come along and eat something like this in North America?
Grizzlies.
It's got to be an herbivore. The answer is something you will not see driving to school today. The answer is giant sloths. These were eaten by giant sloths. If you see pictures of these guys, they're like twice as tall as a human being would be, and they can just reach right up into these trees and chow down on these seed pods right here, and then they go lumbering off to some other part of the forest, and they spread the seed pods from one place to another because that's how slowly their digestive system works. And so this right here is an example of a relict species. This species right here existed in the ecosystem where it had a natural way of propagating itself, and the surviving populations of these trees right here aren't doing so well. They survive in pockets, but they don't spread to new places anymore because the process by which they spread has disappeared. And what I wanted to do was think about this idea of faith learning integration as being, in some sense, a relict debate. The idea that we continue to talk about faith learning integration even though it's a thing that emerged in a completely different intellectual ecosystem. Back then, if you look at books that were written in this period of time, there were a huge number of other types of integration processes that commanded the attention of the academic world. And the academic world is trying to figure out how to do those integration processes all at the same time. And so if you flip open a book, you might find a chapter on the integration of theology and the natural sciences as part of a book that's about all sorts of other types of integration that involve other disciplines than theology, disciplines like history, or philosophy, or metaphysics, or logic, and all of those things were treated as though they were part of the same foundational debate. There wasn't this idea that we single out to isolate faith learning integration as a different sort of integration than anything else. Since then, of course, that word has become kind of a term of art. If you hear the word integration, it can mean only a few things, and those things are always contextualized to specialized debates. If you hear them in the context of race issues, they might talk about racial integration. If you hear them in the academy, the word integration applies to faith learning integration, but has mostly been supplanted by the term interdisciplinary in almost every other context. If you talked about integration as the title of a book and anything other than this particular question of integration, you'd seem kind of anachronistic, like you were using a vocabulary that people have moved beyond. I came up with a few different things that I could take as case studies for the difficulties involved in integration, looking outside the realm of faith learning integration, other types of processes that are clearly integration processes that are occurring today in the academic world that present challenges, to try to figure out if some of the challenges that they were facing and perhaps hopefully successfully overcoming would be ideas that could be cross-applicable to the faith learning debate. And so I looked at a few of these different candidates right here, and of course the one I knew best was the one down here at the bottom. We have this strong idea of an integrated STEM curriculum at this point, and it's a powerful new idea. If you go back to the 1980s, you won't see that articulated with the same clarity or the same vocabulary that you see that today. There was an enormous effort that was taken in the late 90s and the early part of the 21st century in which people had to figure out how to sell STEM to the world. I think most people would say that that was a very successful project. It was an acronym that almost nobody knew in the year 1990, and that almost everybody knew in the year 2010. In some sense, people complain that the project has been too successful at this point, that STEM is mopping up money that should be going toward other aspects of the academic world. It should be going toward the humanities, and now everything has to be marketed in terms of STEM. But whatever this project was, it was a really successful integration process, at least at the level of public opinion. Some of the other candidates I put up at the top right here, we now have a more integrated approach toward the health sciences. Health sciences have been undergoing something of a revolution over the last generation or so. And we also have this kind of funny quasi-religious debate over what it means to pursue social justice that's occurring in the academy, and that's been deeply controversial, and in some ways that's the closest analogy that we have to some of the controversies that we've had in the context of faith learning integration. But I felt like this was the thing where I could bring to bear the most of my own personal experience in terms of explaining what lessons that might have to offer us as people trying to figure out how to better do faith learning integration. Let's do a little bit of history first, though. All of us live in a world in which there are a whole bunch of aspects of our college or graduate education that we are taking or have taken for granted. One of the funny experiences that you have as you transition from being an undergraduate student to a graduate student is realizing just how differently those two models of education function. The idea that we have that undergraduate education ought to be one sort of thing, and that graduate education ought to be another sort of thing, were not things that emerged completely in isolation. They didn't happen by accident. They happened as a result of a long-standing debate between opposing philosophies. If you look back into the early development of the U.S. education system, what you see is that the first education system, because North America and the colonies that were to become the United States were colonized by the British, we naturally inherited a British model for what education was supposed to be. So the early American universities were modeled after places like Oxford and Cambridge, and the experiences that people had in those institutions were carried over to the new colleges and universities being created in the United States. And the creation of those new institutions were explicitly modeled in a way that carried those characteristics forward. So if you were going to some college back in colonial America, your experience would be of coming to a college where you'd come in with a class of people together, you'd have a strong identity of association with that class, you'd have a single professor who would be your mentor, you'd go to all of your classes together. They were relatively small back in those days, so that was an easy thing to achieve, and you'd get to know that mentor really, really well. You'd have debates and discourses with all of the people who were part of your class, and it was just natural that in that environment, you'd all want to live together, right? You'd have some kind of shared living arrangement where you could just you'd go out and have a debate with somebody else or have a discussion with somebody else right in the middle of the evening without having to undergo some big process of moving everybody to some centralized location. So this model of residential education that we've all inherited came from that world. And then in the middle of the 19th century, you started seeing the intrusion of an alternative model, a model that was more continental, Northern European. And this continental Northern European model that I'm calling the Germanic model over here came in and tried to revise that old British-derived system of education by taking it in a more research-oriented direction. The idea that you're going to have students come in and spend more of their time in what we think of today as a laboratory setting, that would be working more independently of each other, that have more specialized, focused discipline, and that would be the thing that would be their primary educational experience. They wouldn't sit around and form debating societies. They wouldn't live in residential facilities where they were constantly interacting with each other. Instead, there would be a lot more emphasis on a purely vertical relationship that would involve a lot of personal contact between an advisor figure and a student figure, with each student figure working on a very independent project. And these two models coexisted for a period of time, and it wasn't clear what was going to happen as they coexisted with one another. We know where the story ends, right? We know that the story ends with this becoming our graduate model over here, and this becoming our undergraduate model over here. And so everyone just takes for granted that the moment you go from being an undergraduate student to being a graduate student, your life is going to dramatically change in terms of how you relate to the campus. When you're an undergraduate student, they're almost going to require you to live on the campus. If they want to enforce this idea of a residential experience, we want people to be in contact with each other all the time so they can study together and work together. And the moment you hit graduate education, all of a sudden, that's not so important anymore. All of a sudden, we're going to be doing something completely different. And what's amazing to me is that this contentious debate from the 19th century right here, which spread right up until the beginning of the 20th century, has mostly resolved itself in the direction of coexistence. That these two approaches right here are approaches that nobody feels threatened that the Germanic model is going to suddenly take over and destroy the residential experiences of undergraduates. Nobody feels threatened that this British model right here is going to crowd out quality graduate education by forcing graduates to always be taking lots of liberal arts courses. Instead, people have just kind of made their peace with the idea that universities are going to have two very different systems living under the same roof, and in many cases even interacting with each other. Sometimes undergraduates work in a graduate research group. Sometimes graduates will come and function as TAs for the undergraduates, so that some of their experiences get translated back to the undergraduate experience. And both of those two communities are now living side by side. As this process was occurring, there was a brief crisis in the identity of universities, because it was becoming clear that universities would have to do both those things. The result of that conflict was not going to be that one side would win, but instead there would be a synthesis that ended with coexistence. And so universities had to figure out whether or not the uni, the UNI at the beginning of their name, even still applied. Was the university still a unified experience, or was it just a whole bunch of things that were all being marketed together at the same time? This guy in the center right here is Clark Kerr, and he was the chancellor, I guess is the term, for the entire University of California system, which was a huge state university system that was becoming much more complex. And his job was to try to figure out what was the overarching mission of the University of California educational system. So he wrote this famous essay called The Idea of the Multiversity, the idea that all these new things that universities were trying to do at the same time would be able to coexist with each other. And he emphasized that, in some sense, the university was going to have to do all these things at the same time and find a new way of understanding its purpose that didn't revolve around using a single model for education. And This right here, I've taken what was previously a two pole axis right here and broken it out to a third pole. That's not in any sense restrictive right here. I could easily have added a fourth or a fifth pole over here. There are lots of other things that universities were trying to do, like add in big athletic programs at the same time. But the important thing I wanted to emphasize right here is that once you began thinking about the university as a whole collection of things under one umbrella, that debate no longer seemed like the sort of debate where one side was going to win and the other side was going to lose. Instead, it was more a debate about how the university can keep all these plates spinning at the same time and maintain some sense of shared purpose or direction. And in some sense, the way that the problem was solved was by making it more complicated. I found that really interesting. That before, when we were trying to take two different educational systems and make them live side by side, it was a very difficult thing to do. People felt threatened in that environment. But once you started doing a whole bunch of other things, and in particular, at the end of World War II, there was a lot of emphasis on practical, professional education that was very applied, and that would work for people who were in a bunch of fields where they didn't necessarily need to have this full graduate experience of spending years and years acquiring a PhD. All of a sudden, this world made everybody feel okay, or at least relatively comfortable, with the idea that there wasn't going to be a single unified philosophy. Instead, we have a very dynamic system of education that would sometimes live in that quadrant and sometimes live in that, I'm not sure what the three-way equivalent of a quadrant is. Quadrant's four, really. But sometimes live at that vertex, sometimes live at that vertex, sometimes live at that vertex. And as you look at the history of education since World War II, you can actually see some flexibility as you move around between those different vertices right here, and different institutions specialize in different ways. At LeTourneau, we probably have a natural way of understanding ourselves in terms of that type of a broader landscape. If you look back at the previous diagram right here, you can almost feel where we're going to at least begin our journey. We're probably going to begin our journey living somewhere over in this vertex over here, and then we'll slowly take that as our base of operations and expand in a whole bunch of new directions. But all of the things that inform our identity right here came out of that new, revised, post-war experience of what universities were supposed to do. They weren't there just for an intellectual class, whether an intellectual class of Germanic-like graduate students or an intellectual class of, British-like undergraduate liberal arts majors. Instead, this idea of having education beyond the high school level was suddenly going to be of immense practical value to a huge range of new people in all of these different applied fields. And so LeTourneau was a good example of an institution that stepped in to meet that sudden new need. Kind of looking more locally at my own discipline, now moving on from the big historical picture to a more localized picture, there was also something of a debate between what we think of as applied science, and I'm kind of grouping engineering into that category over there, and pure science, the idea of just kind of sitting down and doing very fundamental theoretical work that was designed to discover new foundational laws about the universe. And if you look back in the 19th century, there was not necessarily a huge amount of dialogue between those two communities. If you look back at who are the outstanding figures in what we think of today as technology or engineering or applied science, often they have a remarkable lack of formal technical training. Thomas Edison over here is kind of an icon of what it was like to be a person who was interested in doing design work back in the 19th century. And he didn't really spend much of his time at universities at all. That wasn't what his job was. He was out in industry, he was testing things, he didn't feel the need to have a whole bunch of sophisticated mathematical knowledge. That wasn't what his educational background was. He was in the shop, working every day right alongside his employees. So he wasn't just a business manager either, he was a person who was actually interested in testing and trying things out. And so you had these two different communities that were existing kind of in isolation from each other. They didn't have a lot of interaction with each other. They didn't have a lot of reasons to overlap with each other in terms of the educational experiences. And that emerged as a feature of education. Engineering in particular required an educational model that was derived from this heavily practical experience that most engineers had back in the 19th century, and that was sustained well into the 20th century. You saw that in the engineering curriculum, even after some of these polytechnic institutes had been absorbed under the broader umbrella of the university, engineering education was a lot different than it is today. You had people who were having an education that had a completely separate curriculum that wasn't very coordinated at all, and they were doing things their own way. And so there was this unmet need. And the unmet need was to find some way to not have those two people completely isolated from each other, those two communities of people completely isolated from each other. We wanted to make sure that engineers and scientists would be in communication with each other, because it was obvious by the middle of the 20th century that new science was being developed, and that new science had some profound implications for what type of engineering projects might be important in the near future. And so there's a report on the Committee of the Evaluation of Engineering Education, 1955, very influential report that came out called the Brenner Report of popular media, that basically went through the engineering curriculum and proposed a radical revision and reconstruction of that curriculum. And so what you're looking at right here is something that probably isn't too far removed from the experiences of most undergraduate engineering students today, but probably seemed incredibly radical to the people who were reading it back in 1955. If you look at the breakdown of all the focus of these disciplines right here, you kind of go from item number 4 right here, which is design-oriented work, the thing that was almost in all of engineering education back in the 19th century. You had engineering sciences, a category of sciences that were very specific to the engineering curriculum that began to emerge in the beginning of the 20th century. And all of that is kind of sandwiched inside of this larger educational experience, because it suddenly seemed important to make sure that engineers didn't miss out on any of these broader reforms that were occurring in the liberal arts curriculum and in the natural sciences. And so you go from 3 and 4 being all of engineering education to 3 and 4 being only about half of all of engineering education. And in fact, the thing that used to be all of engineering education back in the 19th century becomes only a quarter of it, relative to all this other stuff that people have to take. Now, you're still kind of under the burden of that if you're an engineer in here today, because it means that you have an incredibly demanding curriculum. You basically have to do a mini liberal arts curriculum on top of what used to be an engineering curriculum, and squeeze all of that as close as you can into 4 years. And so this was something that presented enormous logistical difficulties, but it seemed necessary. And part of the reason why that seemed necessary was because after World War II, all of a sudden, this idea of balancing what seemed at first to be opposing poles of practical versus theoretical work suddenly seemed like a much more complicated project. All of a sudden, you had contributions from people in industry and in the military who had very specific needs. You wanted to make sure that people were educated, but educated in ways that were very different from a standard master's degree. You wanted people who would be educated very well, but in certain applied technological areas that didn't always require the same type of specializations. And so once again, you go from having a simple 2-axis system where there are these 2 communities of people who are each doing their own thing and don't want to give an inch to the other, to this more complicated world where there's 3 or 4 or 5 different poles on your distribution, and all of a sudden, you have a system that becomes dynamic. This dynamical system right here allows you to sometimes talk about this stuff over here, and then when you think, oh, I'm spending too much time talking about the applied practical side of things, we can start moving into the engineering sciences side of things, we can start moving into the foundational sciences, physical sciences side of things, and as you look at the development of engineering education since the 1950s, you can see an ongoing debate about how we're supposed to move through these different areas of education specialization, whether we're overweighting one or the other, but it no longer ever feels like the same sort of binary one world versus another world dynamic that you've had back before 1955. In some sense, the acronym STEM has basically created that dynamic as a permanent feature of the way in which we present those disciplines to the world. The idea that it's not just the integration of science and engineering, but it involves technology and mathematics, and these days people are even trying to shoehorn some of the humanities into that acronym as well. And as that picture became bigger, again, the irony here is that an integration project that involved more things was an easier integration project than an integration project that involved fewer things. The idea of taking all of these different priorities and mixing them into a single pot created a world in which nobody felt as deeply threatened that their world was going to be sacrificed for the sake of somebody else's. And seeing both of those two patterns, the pattern broadly for the university system as a whole, and the pattern locally for the way in which we approach STEM education, made me think, there's probably some underlying reason why that was a good approach. And maybe we can take aspects of that approach and generalize them in ways that would be applicable to how we do the integration of faith and learning. So I went back and read this paper. This is a paper by Ken Dapley, who's actually a guy who was at the HIRES conference when I was there. He's an older guy. He's local to Texas. I think he's at Baylor these days, one of the bigger Texas universities. And he's one of the people who's written historically about where this integration debate came from. And this article right here, Resisting Curriculum Integration, was not specific to faith learning integration. It was a broad perspective. In general, anytime you're trying to make an interdisciplinary implementation, what are some of the reasons that that interdisciplinary project is a difficult one? He came through and kind of categorized the experiences that departments have had trying to do these sorts of things into three big areas right here. Logistic resistance, psychological or sociological resistance, and epistemological resistance. Of these three categories right here, I want to emphasize that I think the first one, the idea of a logistic difficulty, looms pretty large in people's heads. I don't really have any proposal to make for that because in some sense it's a thing that does get worse the more complicated the project becomes. The more things you're trying to juggle at the same time, the harder it is to find the time and the training and the assessment tools in order to complete that particular project. And so the first thing right here is in some sense a thing that I think has gotten worse for each of the previous two examples I gave before. It has certainly not gotten easier on a logistic level to solve the problem of integrating different models of education or solve the problem of integrating different disciplines within the STEM cluster. But I think that the second thing right here is the thing that we can focus on as something that created a transformed environment. What happened at the end of World War II that made it easy to integrate all these different disciplines into what we think of today as a STEM cluster? And the answer is that you suddenly had this external dynamic that came as a result of the United States emerging from World War II as an economic and a military superpower with a clear external global agenda that suddenly made people feel as though they didn't have the previous motivation to fight internally, but instead they had a shared external mission. And so it seemed to me like the second idea right here did the best job of explaining why all of a sudden these things that previously seemed like hard integration problems and commanded long books back in the first half of the 20th century suddenly began to click and started working in a more organic way. Not that the debates went away necessarily, but that people were willing to work on them and they didn't seem any more like they were deadlocked. They didn't seem like they were locked down into some kind of quagmire anymore. There are some underlying epistemological issues as well about what it even means to be able to integrate different things in a world where sometimes those attempts at integration seem unnatural. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to integrate so many things because there really are non-overlapping areas of reality that shouldn't be forced to live in combination with each other. And you sometimes hear that critique as well. Steve?
Are you saying that the Cold War and the Russians launching the first satellite into space forced us to do this integration?
I think there was an urgency that came out as a result of having that shared collective experience. All of a sudden, it felt like a priority in a way that it didn't really feel like a priority before. Unfortunately, that experience is hard to replicate. We can't force faith-learning integration through the fear of some external threat like communism, trying to do something to our communities right here, at least not in a way that's easy to package and sell to people. But I did want to go through and think about what was it that was a problem psychologically or sociologically that was resolved by that external dynamic? What was the thing that caused that to be a difficult problem to solve in the first place? And so I wanted to turn to politics instead. One of the, I know, everybody's already a little bit nervous, which is great, because that's exactly the thing I want people to think about right now. I want you to think about the fact that the moment somebody starts talking about politics, everybody gets a little bit nervous. Well, let's start first by talking about 19th century politics, which most of you are probably less nervous about seeing up on the screen. Because when you look at 19th century politics, unless you're a really interested historian, doesn't it all kind of seem a little bit silly? You go back and you read these old impassioned newspaper articles, you read the old political cartoons, and they all seem just a little bit funny to you. You look at these things, and it doesn't seem possible to you that people could have been as animated as they were about any of these issues. These issues seem quaint. They seem outdated. They no longer have any live spark to them. Passion has gone out of them. But I want to emphasize that all these things I've listed over here were objects of intense conflict on the political stage back in the late 19th century. People were incredibly animated by all the stuff over here on this list, and the same way that we today are incredibly animated by all the stuff over here on this list. And something happened that took all these issues right here and made these issues less volatile than they were in the past. And one of your first hypotheses might be, well, these are silly things that people had to worry about back in an old primitive 19th century economy. We live in a modern economy that's moved beyond all of these things. But that ends up not having as much explanatory power as you might hope for. In particular, a lot of the stuff that's on this list right here are issues that are still very important today. Monetary policy, how we handle debt, continues to be a very active issue in terms of how the government has to set policy, but it's lost a lot of its cultural significance. There's no longer a clear cultural divide that stems from how you feel about what the government does to regulate and manage debt. The same thing might be said for tariffs, which are kind of representative of trade policy in general. We still have debates over tariffs. That's happening right now. The Trump administration is proposing tariffs on things like steel and solar panels. And all of those debates are very important to industries. Industries can make a lot of money or lose a lot of money depending on the outcome of those debates. But they don't have cultural purchase on our identities. There's no clear division. If you go online and start talking about tariffs, you're not going to suddenly take a room full of people who were agreeing before and put them at one another's throats, because those issues don't have the power that they did back in the 19th century. And instead we've dealt with a whole bunch of new issues. Kind of ironically, and I put this down here at the bottom, the thing that seemed like it was most localized in the 19th century was the Civil War. I mean, surely if you were a 19th century person trying to guess which of these issues would stop being important in over 100 years, you'd guess, well, maybe the handling of former Confederate states in the Civil War would be a thing that would go away and no longer have a lot of dynamic significance. And yet it seems like this doesn't quite ever go away, right? We're still, in some sense, refighting portions of the Civil War. You can still see that happening in debates over, Confederate memorials today, or the Confederate battle flag. All those things maintain a much more powerful grip on the cultural imagination than some of the more significant issues that deal with things like monetary policy and have enormous implications for what's going to happen to the economy in 10 or 20 years. So I wanted to take that model right there and think about what that tells us about controversy within science in general, and maybe particularly within science and faith debates. And one of the interesting experiences you have when you teach science and faith issues in the class is that some issues seem like they have almost no cultural tension at all, and some issues seem like they have enormous cultural tension. If you go to the, over here I've got my list of things that are specific to science and religion right here, and then over here I've got a list of scientific issues that feel like they generate a lot of heat. If you wanted to go online and get a random internet forum really angry about something, as a troll, you can just kind of pop in and start typing about one of these issues right here and get people pounding on each other. And the idea that some of the things over here overlap with this and some of the things over here don't overlap with that seems like it represents a source of some of the problems that we have in terms of integrating science and faith. You know, of the things on this list right here, two of them, the origins debate, more or less is replicated in perfect reproduction in the secular political world as an education-oriented debate in terms of what the government should regulate or fund. Environmental ethics crosses over pretty dramatically into the climate change debate in the secular realm. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff down here. Maybe stem cells kind of has something to do with abortion, so that has a little bit of overlap. And you get down to the stuff at the bottom right here, and you talk about that in class, people aren't even sure what their position is, let alone when they're supposed to be angry about someone saying something that violates that position. The bottom issues down here are incredibly important. I want to emphasize, if you went through the Bible and looked at all the times it talks about prayer or God exercising activity within the natural or the political worlds, you'd have entire books of the Bible that are heavily devoted toward those topics. And so these things, divine agency and prayer at the bottom right here, or some of the implications of what it means to live in a quantum universe, seem like they ought to be really important to us theologically. And yet, you can start up a conversation about those things, and nobody feels deeply threatened about it. You don't really have a situation in which people's blood pressure starts to rise or people feel like they have a position they need to defend. People come in relatively open to listening about to a whole bunch of different perspectives and these categories right here. I don't think this is accidental. I think the fact that the top items on the list, maybe the first two or maybe the first three things on that list, seem like they're more important to us, even though intellectually it's easy to make the case that maybe the bottom things on this list are the things that are actually of greater theological significance, is a sign that our approach toward faith learning integration has been heavily contaminated externally by this secular debate over here that's resulted from a tribalized approach toward debating these sorts of issues. So I started looking into the literature of psychology and sociology to figure out whether there are solutions to this type of problem. We saw the same pattern emerging over and over again, right? We saw a two-pole system that didn't result in a lot of integration process being replaced by a multipolar system with three or more different possibilities, in which all of a sudden progress just seemed like a thing everybody took for granted. There was no longer an extensive debate over whether or not there should be some kind of interdisciplinary synthesis. Instead, people just kind of went back and forth on how that synthesis was supposed to look. And one of the things you discover when you look at the dynamics of people is that they naturally try to organize themselves into camps. And you can do this in psychology experiments in ways that are very artificial. You can start breaking up people into different categories on the basis of utterly contrived and artificial standards. You can give their teams two different names, and they'll instantly start identifying with their particular teams and fighting for the objective of whatever team they've been assigned to. They create the sense that the people who are part of their team, part of their in-group, are better people, and the people who are part of the other team, the out-group, are necessarily doing things wrong. They're doing something fundamentally wrong. And the more your debate looks like that, the more problematic your debate is going to be. If you want a healthy debate, you want to make sure that you suppress that dynamic as much as possible. Anything you can do to make it look as though there are three or more camps involved in that discussion is going to be a much less in-group dynamic prone debate than if you just have two clearly defined groups over here. And a bigger problem for us specifically in the sciences is that we know that the moment that people start thinking in those categories, the moment people start thinking in terms of my team wins only if your team loses, or vice versa, the moment they stop thinking scientifically at all, In fact, there's a strong suppression of people's ability to accurately interact with scientific data, to interact with the evidence that comes from experimentation. The moment that dynamic emerges, people will look at exactly the same data set and draw radically different conclusions once you activate whatever portion of the brain it is that's responsible for generating that powerful desire to protect your in-group and make sure that the out-group doesn't win. And because science is so strongly committed to making sure that people have this neutral or objective way of interacting with evidence, virtually any intrusion of something that seems like it has this us versus them dynamic will fundamentally make your students worse at being scientists. Anytime they sense that the dynamic is present, they probably can't turn off the parts of their brain that begins to activate the desire to protect the in-group. And once the desire to protect the in-group becomes active in people's minds, they no longer function anything like scientists do. So I kind of drew this in as a lesson that we take away from the way that we present science and faith. And to some extent, we're all guilty of this a little bit, even though as members of the Christian education community, we try to fight back against it more than a lot of other people do. I think we do a much better job here at LeTourneau than 90% of the country would do. But at the end of the day, everybody comes in with this idea that these things represent communities. Not just that science is a methodology, but that science is a world of people, and those people have specific objectives. And religion is a world of people, and those people have specific objectives. And that those two worlds are each working toward their objectives, and periodically they come into conflict with each other, and they utilize very different methodologies to solve that problem, and those methodologies can't coexist very well because they involve too many things that seem dissimilar to each other. And kind of the recommendation that comes from what I've looked at before is this idea that you want to make your project more complicated in order to make it psychologically easier to process. If you're in a situation where you've got issues that seem like they involve only two camps, your life is going to be pretty difficult because people will assign themselves voluntarily to one of the camps and start fighting each other. But if you move into a world where it seems like they can't figure out that there even are two camps, then that dynamic gets turned off. And all of a sudden, students are forced to interact with a whole bunch of different categories at the same time. And so the more that you can take debates and restructure them so they look like they involve lots of different poles that you have to spend different amounts of time living in, the more you can create a dynamic interaction that doesn't involve the appearance of a zero-sum game. The farther you move to the left, the less you are to the right. You've got an environment that's a lot more comfortable for most people to function in. And so one of the things that was recommending in the talk I gave is introducing a third layer of integration. You're not just integrating faith and learning, or faith and science in my particular case. You're integrating faith, science, and philosophy, or faith, science, and history. That increases the logistic burden, right? Because all of a sudden, it's not just good enough to know about science and a little bit about theology. You need to know about this third thing as well, and that makes your life a lot harder. But if you can successfully do that as a teacher, and I think that this applies to Christians who are moving out into the world, into the workforce, who are trying to present ideas to other people, as part of your evangelism, your mission to the world, the more you can present ideas as part of a complicated dynamic that involves lots of different poles having to balance off of each other, instead of a simplified dynamic that involves a single axis, the easier it's going to be to make sure that people don't quickly decide, well, you're on the other team, and I shouldn't have to listen to you, and shut down their normal scientific reasoning processes. Okay, I'm going to call it right here. This is the end of the talk. Here are my big conclusions right here. I guess, as usual, I've gone a little bit too long. I should have 5 minutes for questions. But if you have any questions about my talk, you can go ahead and meet me. I guess we'll probably go over to lunch next. So
We have a couple minutes for questions.
a couple of minutes? Okay, go ahead.
Steve Frazier, not one that's in there.
I honestly don't understand how the team mentality would go away. Wouldn't you just say, oh, they're not part of my team, instead of saying that they're part of the other team?
Well, I mean, I gave you an actual experiment that was done by researchers in psychology saying that people, once they're in an environment where it seems like their losses aren't somebody else's gains. It seems like there's a third party present, a third group present. They no longer feel anywhere near as threatened by that exchange. What you're saying is the opposite of what the psychological research seems to suggest. People don't feel as bad about losing when there are two different possible winners out there. Yeah.
This might be a more psychological question, but building on that, would you say that I would infer that human aggression is one-dimensional?
I'm not necessarily sure I'd say it's one-dimensional, but I think it can only really be activated in one way at a time. There's one threat. You think about kind of sequentially. So this is your threat right now, this is your threat right now, this is your threat right now. And as a result of that, once you're in an environment where you kind of have this three-way interplay, I think that people are less inclined to see threats at all.
Okay, well, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Got one.
There was a question.
Pretty good.
Go ahead.
So, in regard to one of your last comments about introducing it theologically to people, are you saying that maybe instead of just having right and wrong, we try to make gray as well, so that there are no two sides?
I don't like the, I mean, to me what you're saying right there is more like saying that you should be somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, be kind of moderate on the one-dimensional spectrum. But really what I'm thinking about is trying to make the process more complicated. It isn't black versus white anymore, it's now red versus green versus blue. And what you get when you mix red, green, and blue is not necessarily gray. There can be a lot of different things in between.
Oh.
Okay, well, I think one-dimensionally the threat right now is hunger. Lunch, and please join us if you'd like to in the Joyce Room. Next week.